Now, although we are talking about assessment in the context of school, this conference is really touching on aspects of assessments in the context of, work participation and so on. So this is pretty much a conversation that ties to what we have been talking about. So we came up with this title for this presentation that is about developing a learner appraisal system for use in supporting education in an emerging country school system. Now, we just preferred the word emerging country because, these are the lingua franca about developing countries and the developed countries. Now, so myself and my team prefer to use emerging country in the context of, the basic human, development indicators on which the country is making progress, which to us speaks more closely to evolving systems in education, in the economy, the social world, much more than the use of the word developing country. But as I'm saying, it's just a preference of us. Let me go straight to who was involved in this. Like I said before, the Minister of Education of the Botswana government, it's called the Minister of Education and Skills Development, and the Africa Scholarship Development Enterprise, which is based in Pennsylvania in the United States, of which I'm one of their principal researchers. And of course, we recently partnered with JVR Psychometrics, who are hosting this conference as test, to kind of print and distribute the test, because JVR is very highly skilled in, test platforming, and so they come highly recommended, and we are so excited with the work they produced. Now, I'll be speaking to what's in these boxes. So these are just the prototype versions of the of the test that they helped to package nicely and professionally. And so we are hoping to have a continuing relationship with JVR should we be requested by the Botswana government to do the rollout of the test into the schools. They've got about 1,200 schools altogether. So we couldn't be more fortunate to be dialoguing, a very experienced organization in psychometric test platforming. And as you will see, after the presentation, we've got an opportunity. I'll be happy to let you browse the very impressive manuals and other record forms in these boxes. So I just wanted to make sure you are aware that there's stuff to view if you wanted to be, to just take a look, right? And then, so what we're going talking about, what we'll be talking about is that the test development strategy that we engaged, and also just the plan of work procedural approach, and also the final phase, which we completed last year. The test development and adaptation project took us 3 years to implement. And the documentation, which includes this, and also our plans for the rollout across the nation. So, so the specific objectives that the Botswana government asked us to meet for coming up with a psychometric test for use in the country schools were to pilot and adapt, psychometric tests sensitive to the cultural setting of the country, and to identify tests that would be able to identify psychosocial problems and come up with intervention strategies based on the evidence from the tests, and to adapt in measures to help learners map their career path. So the Botswana government is implementing an education system which connects learner achievement to prospective career pathways. which again is an outstanding way to think about education rather than think about it in terms of just the master of the 3 R's. We're going to link that to career pathways. So then they also said in terms of the scope of work, in terms of reference to guide us in what we were doing, they wanted us to pilot, a sample of the test on a sample of students, and also with cultural, of course, representation, and also to cover both primary and secondary schools, and to make some recommendations, and to look at the reliability and validity of scores from these tests, and to give the Ministry of Education and Skills Development reports on our procedures. So that was the basic framework under which we worked. Now I must say that we advised the Botswana government that we were going to be proposing more of tests, not for looking for problems, in students, but for tests that look into assets and strengths in students. Tests that enable students and teachers to have comfortable conversations about who the student is and where they can be. So we said we're not going to be implementing a pathology, view of assessment. So we said that's not what we are going to be, where we are going to be going. We're just going to be looking at tests that are useful supporting students. Then we came up with a team of people to be involved in this, and that would include key personnel, people with extensive experience in test development and adaptation, and also we came up with a team to include the educational psychologists in the country who are practicing either in private sector or in the government sector, and also people from the civic community. And we had the fortune to implement this with up to 60 field assistants. As you can understand, this was a national project, so we needed to be appropriately, staffed for this project. Nonetheless, these are the 4 amigos that were responsible for all the faults that resulted. So if there's anything you passionately dislike, you can blame it on those 4 amigos. All right. So working on this, it was myself and Tom Auckland of the University of Florida. He was involved when we did the framework study in 2009. Regrettably, I'm sorry to share the news that he passed on last year in March. He was such a collegial fellow. How many of you knew Tom Auckland? She did, and he did. One of the best persons you could ever know that ever walked on the face of the planet. May his soul rest in peace. And then there's Cobus Murray. How many of you know Cobus? Oh, he's a great fellow. You work with Cobus, things get done with a high degree of professionalism, and you can always count on him. He's at the University of Pretoria. And James Athanasau is with the University of Sydney. He used to be with the University of Technology, Sydney. And at the time, I was head of discipline over there in the Faculty of Health Sciences, so I poached him from the University of Sydney, of Technology, Sydney, to come to the University of Sydney, right? So he's comfortably in there. He was a very great fellow to work with, and a primary resource in our work with item selection. So we just got a lot of work done. Now, I must mention also Jack Nagrieli, who is now emeritus professor at University of Vermont. who contributed the matrices completion test, which is a non-verbal test of intelligence, for us to trial and adapt in Botswana. So it was tremendously helpful to our effort. So we pretty much worked on various aspects of this. And Tom Auckland contributed the learner styles questionnaire. He published the student styles questionnaire with Psychological Corporation about 25 years ago. And then this has since undergone various translations and usages across the globe. And so we had the benefit of having him on the team contributing that. And Cobus Murray, as most of you know, he is very much into career interest, right? So he has published a test with, kind of several, actually, instruments in career assessment. And so he was our man for that part of things. And I principally took care of the rest of the cognitive ability tests, including social acceptance measures, which are areas in which I published before, starting with my master's degree in education. When I used to, by way of background, I worked as an educational psychologist in Zimbabwe for 5 years, and had the privilege and opportunity to use most of the major test batteries published, from Western countries, like the Westler scales, what used to be called the British ability scales, which is now differential ability scales, and the Woodcock-Johnson and the rest of those. So from that experience, I kind of got hands-on field experience about what works and what the limitations are with most of these measures. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. So for my work with the Ministry of Education in Zimbabwe as an educational psychologist, one of the things I did was to administer, the Westler Intelligence Scale for Children. That at the time, I think it was the second edition. And then, or revised. Now, one of the questions on that test on similarities test is mouse, cow, and lion. How are they alike? Or how are they similar? So the answer is supposed to be animals, right? So you said, okay. Can't go together, because person said, how are they similar? How do they go together? Says they can't go together because the lion is going to eat the cow. So they must have thought, what a dumb fellow. Hey, how could you even ask that? Don't you know that, lion doesn't go together with cow? So I said, I thought like for my master's dissertation, then I did a study on social cultural influences on class inclusion tasks, on performance on class inclusion tasks, right? So, which was pretty much coming out of my field experience, like what are the influences that determine the kind of responses you get? Now, I wasn't interested in whether they got it right or wrong. I was interested in the process, how they processed those questions. Now, I'll be speaking to how we applied some of that in the test development effort in Botswana. So then one of the questions on the, I think this one must be on the what was the British ability scales then, was measles, chicken pox, and mumps. How are they alike? And then it turned out that the students from middle-class homes and upper-middle-class homes had no clue what measles, chicken pox, and mumps were. Why? They got their vaccinations, so they were never sick. The kids from the townships, they knew that those were diseases. So you saw a strong kind of context setting for that. So I was pretty impressed by those differences. Then there's also this other question which said something like head, skirt, and trousers. How are they similar? And then, of course, you would get all sorts of questions about, well, they make a suit, okay? So if someone has got a head, skirt, and trousers, they are putting on a suit. So I thought, yeah, makes sense, actually. Cupboard, wardrobe, and chair. Oh, now this will be kids from the townships and other places. Some of them, of course, some of them go to trades, but someone would say, oh, if you wanted to see what's on top of the wardrobe, what you do is you get on the chair, right? Then on the table, then you check stuff out. Okay. So I did an entire dissertation on that, and I published that in the British Journal of Educational Psychology. And the reviewers were very impressed with that. And also, then I did a follow-up study, which I published in the International Journal of Psychology, which is published by the International Union of Psychological Science. And then, of course, I did a few other things published in Educational Psychological Measurement coming out of that. I was so taken up and engaged with this study. I published like 6 articles coming out of my master's project and enjoyed that. Now, listen, there's what people call blissful ignorance. Okay. So I thought like, okay, you just publish, right? I didn't know that you could get rejected by journals. Anyway, so when we were doing this, we said we're going to put best choices in the world. We're going to make sure we are on top of things, and we're not going to take any less best choices. So the 4 amigos sat around the table and said, that's what we're going to do. And then, of course, the rationale for the battery, as I said before, was to assist learners psychological support and educational support in the school system, and focusing on student achievement. And then we went for low inference tests, which generate data that connected directly to student advisement. Now, so we try to avoid any tests that require, intellectual gymnastics for you to result in a practicable recommendation with students. So I said to the Botswana government, we're going to do low inference tests. And also, one of the reasons for that is we wanted some of these tests to be used directly by teachers at the school level. There are 3 levels of tests, level A, B, C. So we wanted to cover that range and make sure teachers could relate to that, and also relate to the findings. And then, so we wanted tests that would identify resources for learning, that, support dispositions in students to achieve their outcomes. And then, so we came up with this theoretical framework for test development and said we're going to use an integrative test development model in which, in our view, abilities, say verbal ability, representational, and are all nested in a context of learning styles, in the context of which your social behavioral presentation counts in what defines you as a learner. So we came up with this model, which we actually published in a book chapter, which is referenced at the end of the slides. And now, although we tried to be as innovative as possible, we tried not to think outside the box, because it's very dangerous to think outside the box. And so we said, what we're going to do is we're just going to do tests that cover, scholastic, abilities like, word definitions, verbal similarities, which I spoke about before, a recall of digits for working memory, and then matrices for representational learning. So those are domains that you will find covered on most psychological test batteries. Okay. So we were not trying to think outside the box at all. And then we said, well, we're going to include a measure of social acceptance and learning styles, like I spoke to before. And then, we also going to, then there were, of course, record forms for each of these instruments, and we included the career interest inventory in there. Now, the other thing we did was to co-norm the cognitive ability tests with the school achievement tests, so that, we have greater interpretability. Because what used to happen, at least at the time, these are just record forms that were done by JVR. I told you, as you can see, this is very highly skilled productions. So these are just the record forms. What I wanted to say is that in my practice as an educational psychologist in the mid-90s, early 90s to mid-90s, at the time, there were very few tests that had cognitive ability tests that were co-normed with the school achievement tests. So what we used to do was, if we wanted to look into an estimate of whether a student was achieving at an appropriate level, we assumed a correlation of 0.6 between cognitive ability and scholastic attainment scores. And then we used that to calculate any discrepancies in terms of school achievement that could allow us to identify, say, a specific learning disability. Now, the 0.6 rule of the thumb was useful if you didn't have, cognitive ability tests that were co-normed with the scholastic attainment test, so that you have direct evidence about how those, correlate. So we used to do that. So although the Botswana government did not ask us specifically to include scholastic attainment tests, we did that anyway, as a matter of good practice, so that, you have your cognitive ability scales co-normed with the scholastic attainment tests. And so this is the full battery. So you can see there were 11 subtests that we developed over a period of 3 years, and complete with pilot testing and phase 1, where we had the preliminary psychometric features, and phase 2, where we did the final, item selection. So I would say the learner styles questionnaire by Tom Auckland would have, 4 aspects: extroversion, introversion, practical, imaginative, organized thinking, feeling, and flexible. So we're curious about what specific questions could be asked of Botswana students that made sense in the local cultural context. Now, the items on the original learning styles questionnaire by Tom Auckland, which said things like, if I'm visiting with a friend, I pack my my luggage suitcase like the night before, So then, but in a Botswana village, there's no suitcase to pack the night before, okay? All you do is, if you want to visit your friend, you just go there. How? You're done. And then there was another one which says, if I have an appointment with someone, I make sure to be there like 5 minutes before, okay? What I know in village culture is you turn up, okay? Who cares whether you were 2 hours before or just an extra 1 hour after, And knowing also as a villager that if there was even an event at my village home, and you say, people, we want to do this in the morning, what happens is everyone is watching to see whether there are people at the homestead, right? And because everyone is watching for someone to go, no one comes for a while, right? And then someone gingerly walks to there, then everyone comes, right? So the timing is all in a social matrix that has nothing to do with clockwork. So we had our team of local psychologists and others, cultural experts, to look at these items, and so we threw out a lot of American items. The learning styles questionnaire has 69 items. We ended up with 33, and those 33 were not direct items coming out of the learning styles. We had asked culturally appropriate questions that make sense and measure learning styles in Botswana culture. And then, so that was a fascinating experience. And then the social acceptance measure, there's a nice little history about this. I constructed the first social acceptance measure I used for research purposes in 1993. At the time, I was looking at the social acceptance of students in attending multiracial schools in Zimbabwe, and looking at classroom racial proportions, race, ethnicity of teacher, and school achievement. Now, I published that in the Journal of Genetic Psychology. If you want to follow it up, you'll find all the stuff in there. And also, I think I must have published some of that in the International Journal of Psychology. Nonetheless, so subsequently, when I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to do my Ph.D., I decided to do in rehab psych this time. So I said I was going to do a study on social acceptance of students with physical disabilities attending ordinary schools, right, in Zimbabwe. So I can use the social acceptance measure. So it's one area of research, instrument development and application I've been engaged for quite a while. So now we decided to work on some of that and do a social acceptance measure in the Botswana school context for just ordinary school students. And then, so we looked at companionship and also looked at school adjustment. So there are 31 items on this instrument. In my previous instruments, which I used, there were less than 15 items. And then, then COBAS contributed, like I said, the career interest inventory, looking at most preferred and least preferred career options, and which performed wonderfully in the Botswana context. Now, at the beginning of this talk, I spoke to you about that we went through a process to make sure that the items made sense, the test administration procedures made sense to the students. So before we even did anything, we had the cultural translators of all the items, including language translation. So what you have in these boxes are test items in English and also in Setswana, except, of course, for recall of numbers, of digits. Although we have got Setswana translations of that, for our test norming, we just use the English version because the students were more comfortable recalling numbers in English than in Setswana. They found it quite tedious, to remember the numbers in Setswana. I've said going forwards and backwards. Nonetheless, so with the cultural translation, then with the pilot to try out the instructions, like don't just assume that if you say, like I told you before, if you say to students, this mouse, cow, and lion, how do they go together? And you just assume they're going to say animals. They might say something else. So we checked out the instructions, and in my experience, this was state of, best practice that we engaged here to make sure that all the instructions make sense before we went out into the phase one to develop the preliminary items. So I went through a comprehensive system of doing that with the test translations, the piloting, and the phase two, final, selection of items, and resulting in the test battery that we now have, which is going to be out for a rollout. Now, in terms of, we also had the test adaptation model that we adopted for this. So we were willing to go the full range from, guess what, you can look at existing test instruments and look at the kind of questions that they ask and write parallel items. Or we could just, come up with completely new items at all because of the cultural context and what makes sense in that situation. So we had a multi-stage system of deciding whether we wanted isomorphic one-to-one translation from the kind of items you will find in a standard, psychometric test battery, like, say, the differential ability scales, to what would work in the Botswana context. So we had this test adaptation model to guide our efforts. And then And then we did exploratory item development and the calibration before we did the final calibration as a part of as the phase 2. So let me talk about the final phase, which was phase 2. This was after we got the first preliminary item characteristics from phase 1. We were trying now to recalibrate that to see, the concordance between phase 1 trial and phase 2 trial. And then, so for the sampling frame, we engaged over approximately over 5,000 students, but for each phase, we would be working with just over about 2,500 students from standard 1 to Form 5. Now in Botswana, they call them standard 1, then they go into primary, then they go into junior, secondary, then senior. And then so we had, like I said, an impressive and hard-working cohort of young adults and all graduates of the University of Botswana, and who went through an interview process to screen them for interest in this and their background, and we trained them in test administration, and this worked pretty good. They went through a peer review system, and they all passed with flying colors, and we were very impressed. You see, one good thing about psychological test development is that if your team is not well trained, guess what? When they bring in the evidence, it will be pretty much random. The reliabilities are going to be, down, not because of the problem with the items, but because of the poor training of the data collectors. We're very impressed with these folks. So we walked them through. They did a magnificent job. They knew exactly how to hold the manual and how to ask the questions of these kids. And remember, we went through a pilot and a phase 1 before we got to phase 2. So, sample of some of the schools to which our teams went, and some of the break time at the school waiting for students. And altogether, for each, we did proportional sampling of schools because the more primary schools, as you can guess, than mid, junior secondary, and senior secondary. So, and then this was a group administered test. This would be something like matrices completion, or word reading, or number skills, or something like that. I mean, spelling, number skills. For word reading, it was individualized. And for spelling, it was individualized. But number skills, it was group administered, and also the matrices. So these slides just show you like the general situation about that. Now, for the item selection, we used Rush modeling, which is a procedure which indexes items in terms of their item difficulty on a latent scale, and using logarithms to scale those numbers. So, as you know, with Rush modeling, as you might know, the usual cutoff point is you have to start from pick items that score a 0.75, between 0.75 and 1.3 or 1.5. And now, so we wanted to see how that would work out. Now, Rush modeling enables you to have item characteristics, including item characteristics for each of the items to see how it performed. Now, I'm just going to mention that this chart tells you which cutoff points you can use defensively, especially for the item selection. So if anything above 2, you do not want to include, but mostly between 1.5 and 2 you might include. Between 0.5 and 0.5, it's okay. You could include that. Below 0.5, you probably don't want to do that. So So with work definitions test, I'm just going to share with you quickly, some of the features of this and what came out of that. So this was the final phase. So we applying the standard inclusion criteria with Rush modeling, which is 0.75 to 1.5, and then now we had a few items, excluded, and then we decided, like, what happens if we increase this to, say, if we said 0.5 0.56 to 2. Then all the items that were in phase 2 would be included. Now, although if we decided to stay with, say, a cutoff point of 1.5, we would still have excluded maybe only 1 or 2 items, which is pretty good. But let me repeat that this was phase 2 data. We had the phase 1 with a lot more items, which we threw out at the result of phase 1. So for phase 2, because we had the same items, administered to the same students a year later, pretty much. So it's a little bit of, these were relatively clean items to use. And then I'll show you the item statistics. So this is the person item measure, which tells you on the left side here, the dispersion of items, and here the number of students or cases that got or scored right on the item. So when you have a shape which is pretty much like normally distributed like that, it means your items are performing as they're supposed to do. And then, so for verbal similarities, again, I'll just show you what happened with this one. This one is remember the one I told you about where students might read certain things you don't expect when you say cow, lion, and mouse, okay? So we had quite a few exclusions if we had used like 0.56 to 1.5. And then, so we said, okay, what happens if we push it up a little bit to 2, which is where you can go as far and still have reliable measurement. And then guess what? We had only about 5 exclusions. So for our final selection, we used the 0.56 to 2 band. And then we still had some item gaps in there, but nothing too serious. Recall of digits, these are language reduced because they are only saying, say 2, 3, 5, say after me. Okay, 2, 3, 5, say it backwards. That's the backward version. So you can see exclusions are pretty much, and you could pretty much operate within the standard right selection, module of something like 0.56 to 1.5. And then if you used 2, all the items were selected for inclusion. And then with digits forward, I'll show you this chart again. So almost all the items, this is digit backwards, all the items were included. And then so with matrices, which is the test contributed by Jack Nagrieli, the item characteristic was pretty impressive. As you can see, only 2 items would be left out at phase 2. But even for phase 1, the non-verbal test of intelligence by Jack Nagrieli, which we renamed for this purpose, the matrices completion test, performed wonderfully well. And if you used the 2, all the items were included. So we then went into the scholastic attainment tests, and again, those ones performed beautifully. And as you can see, we didn't even have to go to the 2.0 cutoff. All the items were included. And numerical skills, this was a little bit challenging and challenged. And says if you used the 1.5, you had quite a few items excluded. If you moved to 2, you had a good proportion of them included, only a minority excluded. So and the same would be said for the spelling test. This worked pretty good, as you can see. So I would say we were pretty happy with the item selection for the scholastic attainment test. And then this is the test, sub-test correlation for the cognitive ability scales, inclusive of against the scholastic attainment test. These are pretty decent intercorrelations. And you would find about the same intercorrelations of the same magnitude if you checked, say, with the differential ability scales, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Stanford-Binet. There will be something in this range. So we're pretty happy with the outcome of that. And then the social acceptance measure, in which we were saying, like, how is your companionship in the school? And so we used these cartoon characters about whether they were excited neutral, or not happy, okay? And this worked pretty good. And so distribution of items pretty much normally distributed. And what we found most pleasing about this, there were a few items out of this scale that were which we considered for exclusion. So this one performed pretty good. By item, as you can see, at 1.5, only 2 items will be left out. And so the spread of items also following a fairly normal distribution curve. So I would say, all in all, we ended up with 3 items for the learning styles questionnaire that performed well in the Botswana culture. And for the career interest inventory, we looked at the least preferred against the most preferred and did correlation analysis around that, and we were so happy with the results that, the most liked and the least liked were clearly 2 distinct categories of careers. And as Cobus Murray proposed when he initially trialed out this instrument. So, so our deliverables were the prototype tests, which we have here, which are now we are going to be talking to the Botswana government to adopt as the final tests. And so for now, we are just working on with the Botswana government to look at the rollout plan for the psychological test battery. And then we are hoping that we're going to do a field trial implementation in ordinary schools of the rollout. We're going to do it in maybe 1 or 2 districts before we go national. Because you can't just go national, right? You got to learn your lessons from maybe a district implementation. Then after that, you go national. So we're going to be looking at relative advantage of using the test, the compatibility, the complexity of using them at school level, trialability, and stuff like that. So train-the-train approach, we want to give away the tests to the school system. So we're not trying to create a dependency syndrome where they say, no, we couldn't use this if Elias is not here. What we want them to be able to do is to use this one even if we were not there at all. So we're going to train trainers so that the country has the capacity to self-train, in the use of this test battery. And so we resulted with, already we have 3 publications coming out of this because our research is guided by scholarship, and which we share with others, of which this meeting is one of the opportunities for us to share. So that's me during my private life. Okay, thank you.